Good afternoon. My name is CW3 Troutman. I will be conducting training on combating trafficking in persons, otherwise known as Ctip. For the introduction, for this training, you'll learn how to define trafficking in persons, identify who is involved in trafficking in persons, determine why trafficking in person occurs, describe how trafficking in person occurs, explain how to combat trafficking in persons, and identify trafficking in persons law and policy. This training does contain languages and images depicting physical violence and sexual violence. So, just to let you know. Trafficking in persons, or TIP, is one of the fastest growing criminal industries in the world. It's estimated that 20.9 million people are victim of human trafficking. 55% are females, and 26% of victims are children under the age of 18. What is trafficking in persons? It's defined by the United States government as sex trafficking, in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which a person has been induced to perform such act and has not attained the age of 18, or the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt, bondage, or slavery. Let's talk about force, fraud, and coercion. Ctip people typically involve the use of force, fraud, or coercion to compel a person to provide, again, like we talked about, labor or services or commercial sex. Any minor involved in commercial sex is a victim of trafficking in persons. For definitions, severe forms of trafficking in persons, all human trafficking crimes are a serious matter. Severe refers to trafficking in persons that involves one or all acts of fraud, force, or coercion. Location of victims: military personnel, civilian personnel, and contractors may come across victims while serving abroad in the United States. Sex trafficking locations include bars, brothels, dance clubs, strip clubs, massage parlors and spas, escort services, and private parties. Labor trafficking locations may include food service, domestic services, janitorial services, driving services, construction, and hospitality. For types of human trafficking, sex trafficking occurs when a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person who is induced to perform such an act is under the age of 18. Victims can be found anywhere: brothels, truck stops, like we talked about with the other list. Forced labor. Forced labor is labor trafficking. It's recruitment, harboring, and transportation provision of obtaining of a person of labor services through, again, force, fraud, and coercion, and the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt, bondage, or slavery. Forced labor can occur in various forms, and this list is not all inclusive, but nannies, maids, domestic servitude, sweatshop factories, construction sites, farm work, restaurants, and panhandling. Labor trafficking can occur in government contracts or on military installations. Child soldiering is a type of human trafficking. Let's go into some trafficking myths. Human trafficking and all human smuggling are the same crime. That is not true. A person who is smuggled a lot of times is cooperating to come across the border and knows actually what they're doing. Whereas in trafficking, again, that fraud, force, fraud, or coercion comes into play. Excuse me. Trafficking myth number 2. Human trafficking only occurs outside the United States and victims are only foreign nationals. We know that's not true. Human trafficking does not occur if a victim consents. That's not true, especially in the substandard conditions or people who engage in commercial sex, because a lot of times they're recruited by agencies who lie to workers and trick them into signing complicated contracts, or tell them they're going to be doing something else like modeling. So human traffic requires no wage or pay. That's not true also. Human trafficking, you can still earn a low wage or money, but your basic rights are still being violated. Victims of human trafficking will immediately ask for help and will self-identify as a victim of crime. We know this is not true because of fear of trust, self-blame, and also coaching from the trafficker, fear of violence against them. Who's involved in human trafficking? Persons who are causing, are looking for vulnerable people. Victims can be any gender, race, age, nationality, or economic status, man, woman, adult, or child, foreign national, or U.S. Vulnerable populations include undocumented migrants, runaway and homeless youth, women and children with limited resources, oppressed or social culture group, victim of prior sexual or physical abuse. Human trafficking can occur even when the DoD contracts inside or outside the United States. Trafficker profiles, it can be organized criminals, national or local gang members, corrupt government officials and police, not me of course, business owners, pimps, diplomats, United States military or civilian personnel, and United States contractor. Again, this is not an inclusive or exhaustive list. Trafficker profiles, obviously force, and then again that coercion and fraud come into play. Why does Ctip occur? Why does trafficking persons occur? Again, we talked about violence, civil violence, no job opportunities, no civil rights, corruption, prior sexual abuse, and poverty. And they influence people with job opportunities, freedom and liberty, and a chance for a better life, even though they're most of the time laughing. Why does a trafficker have this motivation to do this? It's a $32 billion plus enterprise across the world a year. And unlike drugs, the victim can be used over and over again, and saves and makes the trafficker a lot of money. And there's a low risk to getting in trouble, believe it or not. Going through here, we talked about how victims are lured with fake job offers, promise of love and marriage, better education for their family and life, debt bondage, kidnapping, abduction, blackmail, and extortion. These techniques include, again, violence, beating, rape, isolation, starvation, false promises, and then harming a family, deportation, shaming, and even brainwashing. Luring the victims, a lot of times there's addiction problems too, and so that combination of violence and addiction is very strong. Victims often face physical and mental health issues related to their situation because of malnutrition, depression, suicidal thoughts, PTSD, and just because of the environment they're living and working in. So what are some indicators? You can see signs of physical abuse on somebody. They don't have ID. They live at a confined work site. They're always escorted or monitored. They're indebted to their employer. They're fearful, submissive, anxious, nervous, lack of free will. If you do detect somebody in this situation, don't get directly involved. Report that to the proper authority. And I'll be honest with you, now it is a hot button issue. There are actually human trafficking detectives now in most police departments, so that's how big an issue this has become. And the United States initially adopted a zero tolerance policy by signing the National Security Presidential Directive in 2002. Also, the DoD Instruction 2200-01, Combating and Ctip Trafficking in Persons, established policies, procedures, responsibilities, and information and reporting in a zero tolerance policy in the DoD. There's also an Executive Order 13627 that strengthens and bolsters the compliance of these zero tolerance measures. These laws were enacted and they just keep getting stronger and stronger because unfortunately combating trafficking in persons is getting stronger and stronger. Military personnel are held accountable under the UCMJ and federal and state criminal codes. Civilian personnel and contractors are also held accountable. We talked about child soldiering because we go abroad. We've seen that. And there are websites you can reach out. Again, in this training, you learned how to define Ctip, identify who's involved in trafficking in persons, determine why they traffic in persons, determine how trafficking in person occurs, explain how to combat it, and identifying trafficking in persons laws and policies. I'm CW3 Troutman, and this was Combating Trafficking in Persons.